This task will walk you through the process of applying basic labels to the map. Lab 7 in this course will cover advanced labeling techniques, so for this map we're going to keep the labeling fairly simple and focus on overall map design, layout, and projection choices. So I want to open the layer properties for the USA States area and choose the Labels tab. And at the top I'm going to check Label this layer with, and I'm going to choose Postal as my field that I want to label with, because postal is going to have the 2-digit abbreviations for the states. I'm going to click OK, and we're going to see that the map is now labeled with the postal labels. So let's consider these labels for a moment. First, the labels are a little too small to see clearly. Second, the labels are offset from center in some states, which looks awkward. Third, in the smaller states along the East Coast, the labels are really difficult to read because they overlap at the state lines. And lastly, New York and Florida are not labeled. And there may be a few other states that aren't labeled for you, as you see here, but we're going to work through each one of these issues, and we're going to ignore the labeling because you'll find out later that when we export, the labels will actually show up. So first, we want to increase the font size of our labels to make the postal codes larger and easier to read. So again, I'm going to go back to the label properties, and I'm going to choose text on the left panel here. And I'm going to set the following text properties. First, for my font, I'm going to choose Arial. So it's a nice sans serif font. So let me scroll all the way up to the top here and choose Arial. Then I'm going to keep the style as normal, and I'm going to set the size of the font to 14.0 points. And let's see what that looks like on the map. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. The labels are clearly visible size-wise. However, now we need to adjust the placement of the labels to put them in a more desirable location. So let's work on that next. So reopen the label properties, and now choose placement on the left, and these options need to be set. So on placement, we're going to offset from the centroid of the visible polygon, and I'm going to choose over the centroid of the visible polygon, and we're going to hit OK. And now you can see that the labels are actually placed in a pretty reasonable spot. They're really coming together. Now there are still a few labels that aren't placed optimally. So for instance, Louisiana, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. However, the other states' labels are placed nicely. And so we're going to deal with the non-optimal label placements in Lab 3 where we work on the layout. So we're going to sort of ignore those for now. But let's address the smaller states and the difficulty in reading their labels due to overlap with state boundaries. So what we're going to do is apply a buffer to the labels to provide a nice white canvas for them to sit on top of. So once again, I'm going to reopen the label properties, and I'm going to choose buffer on the properties list. I'm going to set the following buffer properties. So I'm going to check draw text buffer. I'm going to set the transparency to 20%. For the pin style join, I'm going to say round, and I'm going to click OK. And so now you should see something that looks like this. And so while the labels are now easier to read, let's do something a little non-traditional and put a different background behind the labels to make them easier to read even more than they are now. So instead of a buffer that follows the strokes of the letter, as you see here, let's put a semi-transparent white ellipsis behind the text. So to do that, once again, we reopen the label properties, choosing buffer from the properties list on the left hand side, and I'm going to uncheck draw text buffer. Now I'm going to choose background from the properties list, and here I'm going to check draw background. For the shape, I'm going to choose ellipse. For the size type, I'm going to choose buffer, and the size, I'm going to do negative 0.5 millimeters. There we go. For the X, 0.5, and the Y. And so the negative sizes are actually going to make the ellipse smaller and tighter around the label, which is why I'm doing negative numbers instead of positive numbers. I am then going to come down and set my transparency to 40%. And I'm going to click OK, and now you can see each label now has an ellipse behind it, and it really makes the text easier to read. So if you prefer the buffer to the ellipse, feel free to change it back, or better yet, explore other labeling options to find one you prefer. However, for the remainder of this and this lab, Lab 2 and Lab 3, the assumption is that you're going to have ellipsis behind the labels, so if you do not, you may need to adapt the lab instructions to fit your best choices, your label choices. So the fourth issue we identified with the labels earlier is that New York and Florida do not have labels. So additionally, with the backgrounds added to the labels, Massachusetts now does may or may not have a label. So in this case, for instance, Rhode Island doesn't have a label as well as other ones. And so here's the reasons why this happens. First, there's overlap. And that would explain Rhode Island. If there's too much overlap, the labeling engine is not going to want to place them because it thinks that it muddies it up too much. Next is, and this is the reason for Florida and New York, is that because Florida and New York are composed of multiple polygons stored as a single feature in the shapefile, and the QGIS labeling engine is attempting to label one of the very small polygons and finding that it's too small to be labeled, therefore it's not applying a label. So if you actually zoom close in the New York or Florida, it will eventually place a label on the largest polygon, but that doesn't really help us here when we're zoomed all the way out. So you know, other states that are composed of multiple polygons may not be afflicted by this issue, but there are either some inconsistencies in either A, how QGIS decides how to label multi-part polygons, or B, the order in which the polygons are stored in the shapefile. In either case, labels for those missing states will need to be added manually, and that's going to be handled in Lab 3. So moving on to the missing labels in the New England area, again it disappears because the backgrounds of the surrounding states overlap slightly, and so because of the conflict, QGIS is not going to place them. So we're going to need to override that behavior to get those other labels back. So to do that, I'm going to reopen the label properties, and I'm going to choose rendering from the properties list. So from here I'm going to set the following parameters. I'm going to check show all labels for this layer and scroll down, and I'm going to suppress labeling a feature smaller than 1 millimeter, and so that's those really small areas. So for instance, Washington DC I don't want labeled, and that's going to be less than 1 millimeter on this map. So I'm going to now click OK, and now you can see that I've got the Connecticut and New Hampshire and Delaware ones back, but now I still don't have Rhode Island, so again we're going to have to deal with that manually later.